The rain wasn't just falling that night in Maple Falls, it was attacking my roof like it had a personal vendetta. Every gust of wind rattled the old window panes in my rented mountain cabin, the kind of night that makes you think twice about even stepping out to check the mail. I was curled up on my sagging couch, wearing my favorite faded Carolina Panthers hoodie, scrolling through freelance design job postings on my laptop. It was supposed to be another quiet Friday night, exactly why I'd moved here from Charleston 2 years ago. I'd had enough of the Carter family's high society gossip mill and my older sister Chelsea's endless trail of chaos. Oh, my name's Madison Carter, but everyone calls me Maddie. I'm 26, a full-time graphic designer working from home, and I thought my days of getting dragged into other people's messes were behind me. If you like stories about family, grit, and finding your own path, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it. It helps me keep telling the truth, no matter how messy it gets. That night, I learned drama knows where you live, even when you've changed your address. A knock cut through the thunder. Not a polite, neighborly tap. This was sharp, urgent, like someone was pounding just to see if I'd flinch. I frowned, muting my laptop, and padded barefoot to the door. Out here, knocks this late usually meant a neighbor in trouble or a package drop gone wrong. When I opened the door, the wind slapped me full in the face. At my feet sat a baby carrier, drenched, rainwater dripping onto the doormat. My breath caught. The baby inside couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, wrapped in a pink fleece blanket that was already damp at the edges. Her dark eyes were wide open, fixed on me. Not crying, just watching, as if she were trying to figure out who I was and whether I could be trusted. "Hello?" I shouted into the storm, scanning the driveway. That's when I heard it. Tires screeching on wet asphalt, fading fast down the hill. My stomach turned cold. Whoever left her had no intention of staying. A folded sheet of paper was wedged under the carrier's handle, flapping in the wind. My hands shook as I pulled it free, instantly recognizing the jagged, looping handwriting. I can't do this. She's yours now. Chelsea. For a moment, the whole world narrowed to that single line. Chelsea. My sister. The same Chelsea who'd blown through high school parties, bad boyfriends, and rehab stints like they were phases. The one who could disappear for months, then reappear as if nothing had happened. The rain pelted harder, soaking my hoodie, snapping me out of my trance. I scooped up the carrier, light as air, which made my chest ache, and carried it inside, shutting the door against the storm. Up close, the baby looked even smaller, her cheeks flushed, a wisp of damp hair curling at her temple. She blinked at me like we were in some kind of unspoken standoff. "Okay, Maddie," I muttered, pacing past my cluttered desk and half-dead houseplants. "Think. You didn't even know Chelsea was pregnant. What now?" I'd come to Maple Falls to get away from my parents' constant criticism. Margaret and Thomas Carter never approved of me trading pearls and luncheons for hoodies and freelance gigs. And they'd cut Chelsea off entirely years ago when her addiction made the family gossip circuit. Still, this was their grandchild. My fingers fumbled for my phone before my brain could argue. The call connected on the third ring. "Do you know how late it is?" My mother's voice snapped, crisp as a starched blouse. "Mom, Chelsea left her baby on my doorstep, in the storm. There's the note." Silence, except for the faint clink of glass on glass. Then, flatly, "Well, Maddie, I suppose she's your responsibility now." "What? Mom, I can't." "Your sister made her choice," she cut in, colder than the rain outside. "We can't have this scandal getting out. Handle it quietly." I gripped the phone tighter. "Put Dad on. He's asleep. And don't raise your voice at me, Madison. This is why Chelsea couldn't trust you to handle things properly. Be discreet." Click. I stood there, staring at the phone until the baby let out a tiny sigh, like she was reminding me she was still here. "Just us, huh?" My voice cracked. I was 26, barely keeping up with my freelance gigs, and now there was a baby in my living room, silent, steady-eyed, as if she knew I was in over my head. Outside, the storm kept raging. Inside, my life had just been split into before and after. I didn't put the phone down right away after Mom hung up. I just stared at the dark screen, listening to the rain slam against the windows, feeling the weight of what she'd just said sink in. Handle it quietly. It was such a Carter family phrase, sterile, dismissive, like emotions were stains you could scrub out before company arrived. The baby, Chelsea's baby, shifted in the carrier, making the faintest squeak, not a cry but a sound that tugged at something deep in my chest. I crouched down, brushing my fingers gently over the damp pink blanket. "We're going to get you warm and dry," I murmured, though my voice sounded foreign, like I was rehearsing lines I'd never learned. I set the carrier on the couch, grabbed the softest towel I owned, and carefully patted her face and hair. She didn't flinch, didn't fuss, just kept those wide eyes on me. That steady gaze made it harder to breathe. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stopped moving, if I let the reality settle in, I'd crumble. So I did the only thing that made sense at that moment. I called my dad. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Mads?" His voice was groggy, thick with sleep. "Dad, I need you to listen. Chelsea, she left a baby on my porch." "Her baby? There's a note. I think she just drove away." A pause, the sound of him clearing his throat. "Where's your mother?" "I already called her. She said it's my responsibility now." My voice cracked, and I hated that he could hear it. "Dad, please, I don't know what to do." "Maddie." His tone shifted into that careful, measured cadence he used when he didn't want to say the wrong thing, but also didn't want to get involved. "You know your mother's right. This is complicated. And if Chelsea made her decision, she abandoned her newborn in the middle of a storm." My voice rose before I could stop it. The baby startled slightly, and I forced myself to lower it. "You're her grandparents. Don't you care?" "I care," he said, softer now. "But we can't. There's too much history. Too many people watching the family. If this gets out..." "There it is," I said bitterly. "The image. Always the image." "Maddie, I've got to go." I hung up before I could hear whatever half-hearted consolation he'd offer. The silence afterward was heavier than the storm. I sat beside the baby, who was now curled on her side, one tiny fist pressed to her cheek. The note lay crumpled on the coffee table, and I kept glancing at it as if the words might change if I looked long enough. Chelsea's life had always been a hurricane. Rehab stints, disappearances, promises that dissolved faster than morning fog. But I never imagined she'd drag me into her chaos like this. I didn't even know she'd been pregnant. My eyes drifted to the row of picture frames on the shelf, photos from my first year in Maple Falls. Not one of them had Chelsea, Mom, or Dad. I'd told myself that was a choice. Now it felt more like a forecast I hadn't understood. I leaned back, pressing my palms over my eyes. I could hear Mom's voice again, "Be discreet," as if this was some scandal to hide, not a child who needed someone to fight for her. The baby shifted again, this time with a soft, questioning sound. I took a deep breath, pushing myself upright. "Okay. Here's what we're going to do," I told her, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to her or myself. "First, we figure out what you need. Then," I hesitated, "then we figure out if Chelsea is coming back. But I'm not holding my breath." I reached for my laptop, the glow from the screen cutting through the dim room. My search history flipped from design software tutorials to newborn care for beginners in under a minute. I clicked on a video titled, "How to Survive the First Night with a Newborn." The narrator's calm, step-by-step voice felt like a lifeline. Diapers, formula, warm clothes. I scribbled a list on the back of an unpaid electric bill. When the video ended, I glanced back at the baby, at Sophie, though I didn't know her name yet, still watching me like I was the only thing anchoring her in this strange new world. I grabbed my keys. "It's going to be okay," I told her, though my heart was hammering. The cold air hit me like a slap when I stepped outside, rain soaking my jeans in seconds. I locked the door behind me, jogged to my car, and drove toward the only 24-hour pharmacy in town. I was gone 12 minutes. 12 minutes where every stoplight felt like a test, every minute a risk. I kept picturing her waking up to an empty room. When I came back, she was still there, still quiet, still watching. For the first time that night, my shoulders eased. I dropped the bags on the floor, knelt beside her, and whispered, "We'll figure it out, I promise." And though I had no idea how, I meant every word. By the time the storm tapered into a steady drizzle, the little living room of my cabin looked like a makeshift nursery, if nurseries were thrown together in panic at 2 a.m. 2 bags from the pharmacy sat half-emptied on the floor. Formula cans lined up beside a set of bottles I still didn't know how to use, a pack of newborn diapers so small they looked like doll clothes, and a second-hand fleece sleeper I'd grabbed on impulse. The baby was swaddled in it now, her tiny chest rising and falling against the pillow I'd turned into a makeshift bassinet. I sat cross-legged on the floor, laptop open to yet another Newborn Care 101 video, my phone buzzing every so often with work emails I didn't have the mental bandwidth to answer. The practical side of me, what my parents always called the responsible Carter, was screaming for a plan. Call social services, drop her at the hospital, find someone who actually knows what they're doing. But every time I looked at her, that plan dissolved. Around 4 a.m., she stirred for the first time since Chelsea had left her. A faint whimper. I scrambled to remember what the video said about feeding cues, my hands clumsy but determined as I mixed formula. The moment she latched onto the bottle, her whole body relaxed. It shouldn't have felt like a victory, but it did. Somewhere between her finishing 2 ounces and drifting back to sleep, I realized I'd already made my decision. I wasn't giving her up. I didn't know her name. Chelsea hadn't written it, and there was no paperwork in the carrier. But when I pulled the damp blanket away earlier, I'd noticed a hospital bracelet tucked near her foot with a birth date, 12/21, winter solstice, the darkest day of the year. "You're my little light," I whispered. "Sophie. That's your name." She didn't stir, but the name settled into the room like it had been waiting to belong to her. By sunrise, exhaustion had set in like wet cement, but there was no time to collapse. My retail shift started at 9, and I couldn't exactly bring a newborn to work at Harper's Home Goods. I called my manager, Cheryl, rehearsing the words family emergency in my head. "Maddie, you're still on probation," she said, her voice clipped. "We can't approve last-minute time off unless it's medical." "It is medical," I blurted, glancing at Sophie. "For a family member." She exhaled sharply. "Look, I like you, but we have holiday shipments to unload. You miss today, I can't guarantee you'll still be on the schedule." I hung up with my stomach in knots, but I stayed home. Sophie was asleep in the borrowed bassinet, and I couldn't shake the image of her waking up to an empty cabin. That one missed shift turned into another when Sophie spiked a low-grade fever 2 days later. I spent the morning pacing the clinic waiting room, rocking her while the nurse took her temperature and reassured me it was just a mild cold. By the end of the week, Cheryl's number flashed on my phone again. "I'm sorry," she said, though she didn't sound sorry. "We need someone we can rely on right now. I'll have your final check ready next Friday." After we hung up, I sat on the couch, Sophie cradled against my chest, listening to the quiet hum of the space heater. My savings account wasn't much, 3 months' rent maybe, and freelance work was unpredictable at the best of times. "You're worth it," I murmured into her hair, even as my voice trembled. It wasn't the financial freefall that scared me. It was the way losing that job felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing how far the drop was. That night, while Sophie slept, I opened my design portfolio and fired off pitches to every potential client I could find. Midnight bled into 1 a.m., then 2. Somewhere between sending the last email and checking on her again, a strange calm settled in. I'd lost my job. My safety net, my plan. But I hadn't lost my choice. Sophie was mine now. Not by blood, not by law, not yet, but in every way that mattered. I didn't know what Chelsea's endgame had been when she left her daughter in the rain, but I knew mine. I was going to raise this child, no matter what it cost me. If you'd told me that night in the storm that I'd blink and 10 years would pass, I would have laughed in your face. Back then, the days felt endless. each one a blur of feedings, diaper changes, freelance deadlines, and a constant undercurrent of worry. But Sophie has a way of rearranging time. One moment she was this impossibly small bundle I could hold in one arm. The next, she was standing in the front yard, gangly legs and grass-stained shorts, waving a paintbrush at me like it was a magic wand. We'd built a life here in Maple Falls. Not perfect, not polished, but ours. The cabin was still small, still a little drafty in winter, but its walls were alive with her world. Crayon suns on the fridge, glitter projects drying on the dining table, soccer cleats kicked off by the door. My office had evolved too. The cluttered desk in the corner was replaced by a proper workstation, double monitors glowing with logo designs and marketing campaigns. I'd hustled to grow my freelance business after losing that retail job. Late nights, coffee by the gallon, teaching myself new software between bedtime stories. Eventually, it paid off. I could be there for every scraped knee, every school play, every whispered, "Mom, watch this," without glancing at a clock. Sometimes she'd sit beside me after school, doodling while I worked. "You should use more purple in that," she'd say, peering at a client's branding palette. "You think purple fits a law firm?" I'd tease. "It fits everything," she'd declare, and then we'd end up in a 20-minute debate that usually ended with me adding at least one shade of violet. Our evenings were our sanctuary. We'd cook together. Well, I cooked, and Sophie supervised, usually by taste-testing the pasta. After dinner, we'd curl up on the couch with a blanket, watching the fire dance in the wood stove while she read from whatever library book she'd checked out that week. It wasn't all easy. There were days the bills stacked higher than I liked, or weeks when clients ghosted me and I wondered if I was doing right by her. But then she'd bring home a drawing of the two of us, stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, and the worry would loosen its grip. I knew what I'd given up when I left Charleston. Networking events, stability, the Carter family safety net, though calling it safe was a stretch. But I'd gained something far more valuable, the freedom to raise Sophie without anyone else's expectations shaping her into someone she wasn't. By the time she turned 10, she was a whirlwind of energy, running from soccer practice to art club, her hair always escaping whatever braid I'd attempted that morning. Her laugh could fill the cabin in a way the rain never could, and her stubborn streak, well, I saw myself in it, even if I'd never admit it out loud. One Saturday in early spring, we were in the backyard painting an old garden bench. Sophie's idea. She wanted it to be the happiest bench in Maple Falls, which apparently required 6 different colors and enough glitter to blind the neighbors. She dipped her brush into a jar of turquoise and looked at me. "Do you think Chelsea knows about me?" The question hit like a cold gust, though I kept my brush moving. "I think she knows," I said carefully. "But she's not part of our life, kiddo. That was her choice." Sophie frowned, dragging the brush in a thick line across the wood. "Her loss." We didn't talk about Chelsea often. Over the years, I'd made peace with not knowing where she was or what she was doing. My parents stayed in Charleston, sending stiff, impersonal Christmas cards with no mention of Sophie. It was easier to keep that door shut than to let the draft in. But that afternoon, watching Sophie paint, I realized how much we'd managed to build in the space they'd left behind. I leaned back on my heels, taking in the sight of her, turquoise streaks on her cheeks, sunlight in her hair. "Yeah," I said softly. "Her loss." In that moment, the past felt far away. The storm, the note, the cold voices on the phone, all of it had led here, to a life stitched together with small victories and stubborn love, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. 10 years of building a life with Sophie had taught me a few things. Paint always ends up in your hair, soccer cleats smell worse than wet dogs, and real peace isn't quiet. It's laughter echoing through a home you made yourself. That's why the knock hit me like it did. It was a Thursday evening in early fall. Sophie was at her best friend Mia's for a sleepover, and I was halfway through tweaking a logo for a new client, a cozy coffee shop opening downtown. The knock was too sharp, too measured, not the friendly thud of a neighbor. My gut went cold before my feet hit the floor. When I opened the door, it was like someone had peeled back time and poured every bad memory onto my porch. Chelsea stood in the center, looking like she'd stepped out of a glossy magazine spread, hair perfectly blown out, a camel-colored coat cinched at the waist, diamond studs catching the porch light. To her right, my mother, Margaret, had that same tight-lipped scowl she'd worn the day I left Charleston. On her left, my father, Thomas, avoided my eyes, his hands buried in his coat pockets. Behind them was a man in a tailored suit, clutching a leather briefcase like it was a weapon. "Hello, Maddie," Chelsea said, her voice warm but her smile all calculation. "We need to talk about my daughter." My daughter. For a second, the words didn't register, then the heat rose in my chest. "You mean Sophie?" I said, keeping my hand on the doorframe so I wouldn't slam it in their faces. "The child you left on my porch in a storm 10 years ago?" Chelsea's eyes glistened. Too fast, too practiced. "I was sick then, Maddie, but I've changed. I'm sober now, I have a stable home, a career, and a sudden maternal instinct?" My voice was sharper than I meant it to be. The man in the suit stepped forward, adjusting his tie. "Richard Hale. I represent Ms. Carter. We're here to discuss custody arrangements for Sophia." My hand tightened on the frame. "Her name is Sophie, and we're not discussing custody." My mother took a step toward me, the pearls at her throat gleaming. "Maddie, stop being dramatic. Your sister is trying to make things right. It's time for Sophie to be part of her real family." I laughed. It was a short, bitter sound. "Real family? Where was real family when she had the flu at 2 a.m? Or when she made her first goal at soccer? Or when she cried because she was scared she'd never be good at math? You didn't even know she hated strawberry ice cream until I told you just now." "Let's keep this civil," Richard cut in. "Civil," I repeated, my grip on the door tightening. "Like abandoning a newborn in the rain is civil?" Chelsea's expression wavered for a fraction of a second. Then she straightened. "I want my daughter back." The words landed heavy, but beneath the shock was something fiercer. 10 years of scraped knees, bedtime stories, whispered fears. I wasn't going to hand her over like she was some misdelivered package. "You're not coming in," I said, "and you're not taking her anywhere." Richard cleared his throat. "Then we'll see you in court." I stepped back just far enough to pull my phone from my pocket. "Great. Let me introduce you to my attorney." It took exactly one call for Ethan Brooks to pull his blue pickup into my driveway. He stepped out, calm as ever, in a dark jacket and jeans that made him look more like someone's dependable neighbor than a lawyer you didn't want to underestimate. "Perfect timing," Richard said with a tight smile. "We were just about to present custody filings." "Then present them to me," Ethan said, taking his place beside me. "I represent Ms. Carter, Madison Carter." "Fine," my father muttered. "But you knew this was coming, Maddie." "No," I snapped, meeting his eyes for the first time all evening. "I've learned not to trust anything from you." They didn't flinch, but they didn't argue either. Chelsea adjusted her coat and looked at me like she could will me into submission. "This isn't over." I gave her a level stare. "It was over the night you left her." Ethan's voice cut in, firm, but low. "We'll see you in court, Richard. Don't show up here again without going through me." They turned, heading toward the sleek black sedan parked at the curb. My mother's heels clicked sharply against the wet pavement, each step sounding like a warning. When they were gone, I finally let the door shut. Ethan looked at me. "You okay?" I exhaled, leaning against the frame. "No, but I will be." Outside, the air was cool, damp, smelling faintly of leaves. Inside, the silence felt different now. Not peaceful, but tense, waiting. 10 years of quiet had just been shattered, and the fight for Sophie had begun. Ethan didn't leave right after my parents and Chelsea drove off. He stepped inside without asking. He knew better than to wait for an invitation in moments like this, and closed the door behind him. The porch light clicked off automatically, plunging the front of the cabin into shadow. I stood in the entryway, staring at the empty space where they'd been. My pulse still hadn't settled. "You did the right thing," Ethan said, setting his leather briefcase on the coffee table. "I didn't even let them pass the doorway," I muttered, still gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only solid thing in the room. "That's the right thing," he repeated, "because once you let them in, they'll act like it's already their house." I tried to laugh, but it came out thin. They were so sure of themselves, like Sophie's just a chess piece they can move across a board whenever they feel like it. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "They're testing you, seeing if you'll roll over before the paperwork's even filed. We're not going to give them that satisfaction." I sank into the couch, pressing my palms into my knees. "So, what happens now?" "Now," he said, flipping open the briefcase, "we get ahead of them. I'll file a response the moment they submit their petition. In the meantime, we gather everything: birth records, school records, medical history, photos, witness statements, 10 years of evidence that you've been Sophie's only parent." The mention of 10 years hit me harder than I expected. 10 years of scraped knees, bedtime whispers, art projects, and late-night fevers, all reduced to a legal argument. Ethan must have seen it on my face. "Maddie," he said gently, "this isn't about who loves her more. You already know the answer to that. This is about making sure a judge sees it too." Before I could answer, there was another knock. Not the same sharp rhythm as before. This was louder, impatient. I exchanged a look with Ethan. They wouldn't come back this fast. But when I opened the door, there they were again. Chelsea, my parents, and Richard Hale. Like they'd only driven around the block to regroup. "I told you," I started, but Richard cut in. "We realized it's best to lay out our intentions clearly," he said smoothly, "so there's no misunderstanding about what's coming." He held out a manila envelope. Ethan stepped forward before I could take it. "You can hand that to me." Richard hesitated, then passed it over. Ethan didn't even glance inside before setting it on the coffee table. "Miss Carter," Richard began, but Ethan held up a hand. "Mr. Hale, let me save you some breath. My client is not discussing custody in her home, on her doorstep, or anywhere outside a courtroom. If you want to talk, you'll do it through me. Not her, and certainly not with her parents looking over your shoulder like this is some kind of family summit." Chelsea's jaw tightened. "She's my daughter, Ethan." Ethan's tone stayed calm, but his words cut clean. "She's been Maddie's daughter for a decade. You abandoned her. If you want to explain that to a judge, be my guest." My mother stepped in, pearls swinging with each word. "Enough of this hostility. We're trying to make amends." "Amends?" I snapped, stepping forward. "You told me to handle it quietly when she was a newborn. Now you show up with a lawyer and act like you've been waiting in the wings all these years?" My father finally looked up, his voice low. "Maddie, this isn't how it has to go." "No," I said, meeting his gaze without blinking. "It's exactly how it's going to go. Through the courts, where you can't hide behind reputation and closed doors." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "We'll be in touch." "You'll talk to me," Ethan corrected, his tone leaving no room for argument. They left again, but this time the silence they left behind felt heavier, like a storm cloud pressing against the windows. Ethan closed his briefcase with a snap. "We start tonight," he said. "They're going to play dirty. We need to be ready." I nodded, glancing toward Sophie's empty bedroom down the hall. She wasn't even home to know the fight had begun, but I knew, and I wasn't about to let them blindside us again. 2 days after that second knock at my door, Ethan called and told me to meet him at his office. The tone in his voice made it clear this wasn't just about filing paperwork. By the time I got there, the afternoon sun had slipped low enough to cast long shadows across the small downtown of Maple Falls. Ethan's office was on the second floor above a bakery, the smell of cinnamon rolls drifting up the narrow staircase. Inside, his desk was buried under a mix of legal briefs, manila folders, and 2 paper coffee cups, one of which had my name scrawled on it in his messy handwriting. "I asked Logan to do some digging," Ethan said as soon as I walked in. Logan Price, the private investigator Ethan swore by, was leaning against the wall with a folder in his hands. He looked like he'd stepped right out of a small-town cop show. Faded flannel shirt, weathered face, eyes that didn't miss a thing. "What did you find?" I asked, sliding into the chair across from Ethan's desk. Logan dropped the folder onto the table and flipped it open. The first thing I saw was a grainy black and white copy of my grandmother's will, my mother's mother, not someone I'd been close to. "Your grandmother left a trust fund," Logan said. $2 million. Not for your mom or your dad. Not for you. Specifically for Chelsea's firstborn. I blinked. Chelsea's firstborn? Sophie? Exactly, Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. There's a clause in here. Logan highlighted it. The child must be raised within the Carter family household. If they can prove that, they control the fund until Sophie turns 18. I scanned the text, the words swimming, raised within the Carter family household. They don't want her back because they suddenly care, I said slowly, the air in the room tightening around me. They want her back because she's worth $2 million. Logan nodded grimly. And they can't touch a cent if she stays with you. But if they get custody, your parents become the trustees. That's a nice little retirement bonus. I let out a bitter laugh. So this isn't about love. It's about an investment. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. Maddie, this explains why Chelsea's suddenly picture-perfect and your parents are backing her up. They've probably been planning this for months. They're not just going to fight hard, they're going to fight dirty. My mind was already racing. We have to prove Sophie's better off with me, not just emotionally, but in every measurable way. School records, her soccer team, her art projects, everything. We'll get it, Ethan said, but I'm not going to sugarcoat this. If they push the family household angle, it could get messy. Judges can be swayed by that language, especially if they think you've cut Sophie off from her blood relatives. I shook my head, still staring at the will. I didn't cut them off. They walked away. They made themselves strangers to her. Logan's expression softened for just a moment. I believe you. But we'll need more than belief. He slid a second set of papers toward me, printouts of social media photos, Chelsea at yacht parties, charity galas, weekend trips to Aspen, time-stamped across every year I'd been raising Sophie. She didn't look sick or struggling to me, Logan said dryly. Ethan tapped the photos. This is gold. If she tries to claim she was in recovery and couldn't parent, these undermine her credibility. I leaned back, my stomach twisting. So what's next? Next, Ethan said, we dig deeper. Find anyone who can testify to what really happened the night she left Sophie. And we start building the picture of the life you've given her. Because Maddie, he met my eyes. $2 million will make people lie in court without blinking. We can't leave them any room to spin their version. I thought about Sophie, about her paint-streaked hands, the way she laughed so hard she hiccuped, the way she'd curl up next to me during thunderstorms. She was not a number on a bank statement. They have no idea how ready I am, I said, my voice steady now. They think I'm going to fold, but if this is about money, I'm going to make them spend every last dime trying to take her from me. Ethan gave a thin smile. Good, that's the Maddie I know. I closed the folder with a decisive snap. The storm had already arrived on my doorstep once. This time, I was walking straight into it. It was a Saturday afternoon when the first crack appeared in the wall I'd built to protect Sophie from all of this. I'd just come back from Ethan's office the day before, my mind still buzzing with the words, $2 million and trust fund clause. I hadn't told her any of it. I wanted time to figure out how much she needed to know, and how to tell her without letting it sound like she was a prize in some twisted game. She was supposed to be at my parents' house for a court-mandated visitation, one of the few terms we couldn't dodge while the custody hearing loomed. I hated it, but Ethan had warned me that refusing would make me look uncooperative. When I pulled into their long driveway in Charleston, Sophie was already on the front steps. She wasn't reading a book or scrolling on her phone. She was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped tight, like she was bracing against something. I cut the engine and got out quickly. Hey, kiddo, you ready? She stood, but her eyes didn't meet mine right away. Yeah. I could tell something was wrong the moment she got into the passenger seat. Her usual chatter about Mia, soccer practice, or whatever she was painting that week wasn't there. What happened? I asked, as I eased us out of the driveway. She bit her lip. Mom. Mia's mom said something weird when she dropped me off the other day. She asked if I was okay, if I needed to talk about my real mom. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. And what did you say? I told her you were my real mom, Sophie said quickly. But then, today, Grandma was on the phone with someone, and I heard her say you stole me. The word landed in my gut like a punch. I didn't say anything, Sophie went on, her voice smaller now. But is it true? Did you? I pulled over onto a quiet side street and shifted the car into park. Look at me, I said gently. When she did, I could see the worry in her eyes I'd been staring into since that first night in the storm. No, I said firmly. I didn't steal you. Chelsea, your biological mother, left you with me. She asked me to take care of you because she couldn't. That was the best gift anyone has ever given me, even if she didn't mean it that way. Sophie's eyes glistened. But she's back now. Why? I hesitated, weighing how much to tell her. Some people, they see something valuable and they want it for themselves, even if they didn't care about it before. Chelsea and your grandparents think they can give you more because of money, but they don't know you like I do. They don't know how you hum when you're painting or how you eat all the marshmallows out of the cereal before you pour the milk. A tiny smile tugged at her mouth. That's because you're the one who makes me pancakes on Saturdays. Exactly. I reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her face. Being a mom isn't about DNA. It's about showing up. Every single day. And I'm not going anywhere, no matter what anyone says. She reached into her backpack then, pulling out a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing, stick figures of the two of us holding hands inside a big red heart, the words "Best Mom Ever" scrawled underneath in her careful block letters. It's for the fridge, she said quietly. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Then that's exactly where it's going. When we got home, I pinned it up next to a photo of her first soccer goal. She watched me do it, then leaned against the counter like she was trying to anchor herself. You promise you won't let them take me? She asked. I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. I promise. I'm fighting for you with everything I have. What I didn't tell her was that the fight was already uglier than I'd imagined, and about to get worse, but she didn't need to carry that weight. Not yet. For now, she just needed to know one thing. No matter what the Carters planned, I wasn't letting go. The morning after Sophie's question about whether I'd let them take her, I couldn't shake the image of her sitting on those front steps at my parents' house, small, closed off, guarding herself like a grown-up. It hardened something in me. By noon, Ethan called. Logan's found someone who's ready to talk. You'll want to hear this in person. His tone had that edge it gets when he knows a piece of evidence could shift the whole case. 20 minutes later, I was in his office, nursing a bitter cup of coffee while Logan flipped through a legal pad. I reached out to a guy named Brandon Miles, Logan said. He's Chelsea's fiancé. Or was. Hard to tell at the moment. Ethan leaned forward. He's not exactly in their camp anymore. Logan's smirk was quick and humorless. Turns out your parents promised to pay for his wedding to Chelsea if she went along with this custody stunt. He says the trust fund was the whole point, not Sophie. I felt my stomach tighten. So he knew? He knew, Logan confirmed, and he's willing to testify. Says he's sick of being used to prop up their image. I set a meeting for tonight. Public place, neutral ground. That night, we met Brandon at a corner table in a coffee shop just outside Maple Falls. He looked younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with an expensive watch and the kind of tan you don't get in our mountain winters. Chelsea's type, I thought. He glanced around nervously before speaking. She doesn't know I'm here, he said. Look, I'm not proud of it. I played along at first. I thought maybe she'd really changed, but this isn't about family. It's about money. Your parents told us straight up, if she got custody, they'd control the trust fund until Sophie turned 18. $2 million. They promised to manage it wisely, whatever that means. It means they'd spend it, I said flatly. Brandon gave a small, bitter laugh. Yeah, that's what I figured. He rubbed the back of his neck. They're painting you as unstable, saying you took advantage of Chelsea's addiction to keep Sophie for yourself. My pulse spiked, but I kept my voice even. Were they lying about her being sober now? She's been sober for 3 years, he said. But back then, when Sophie was born, she was using bad. She didn't even tell me about Sophie until we'd been together a year. Ethan's pen scratched against his legal pad. Would you be willing to say that in court? Brandon hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, Sophie's a good kid. She doesn't deserve to be a pawn in all this. When we left, the air outside was sharp and cold. I zipped my coat to my chin and felt the first flicker of hope in days. That hope doubled when, the next afternoon, there was a knock at my door. It wasn't the kind that made my stomach drop. This one was light, almost hesitant. Patty Green, my neighbor for the past 5 years, stood there with a determined look. I saw Chelsea on the local news, she said without preamble. She was talking about how you kept Sophie from her. I can't stand lies like that. I invited her in, and over a cup of tea she told me what she remembered from that night a decade ago. I was walking my dog, Maddie. I saw her pull up in that fancy car, same one she still drives. She didn't knock, didn't check if you were home, just set the carrier down and left. Rain pouring, baby crying. I blinked. You'd testify to that? In a heartbeat, she said. I've watched you raise that girl. She's yours in every way that matters. By the time she left, Ethan's folder of potential witnesses was starting to look like a shield instead of a flimsy hope. 2 days later, Logan called again. You're not going to believe this, he said. I tracked down Dolores Mitchell, the housekeeper your parents fired a few years back. She says she saw custody plans in your father's study months before Chelsea ever showed up at your door. Drafts, meeting notes, all of it aimed at getting control of that trust fund. Dolores arrived at my cabin that evening with a manila envelope under her arm. They called you a pretend mom, she told me, her voice trembling with anger. Said once they had Sophie, she'd be a proper Carter. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't want to lose my job. They fired me anyway when I asked too many questions. I took the envelope. Inside were photocopies of the documents she'd risked her livelihood to keep. Dates, signatures, bullet points, proof that their plan wasn't born from love. As I slid the papers into Ethan's growing case file, I caught sight of Sophie's best mom ever drawing still pinned to the fridge. They wanted to paint me as the villain? Fine. I'd show them exactly what a villain looked like when she was fighting for her kid. The courtroom in the Maple Falls County Courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and cold air, the kind that creeps under your collar and makes you sit up straighter. Sophie sat with Mia's mom, Carla, in the hallway outside. Ethan and I had agreed she didn't need to hear any of this unless the judge specifically asked for her. When the bailiff called our case, my legs felt heavier than they ever had on a soccer sideline or in any client meeting. I followed Ethan to our table, eyes forward, pretending not to notice Chelsea and my parents sweeping in with Richard Hale at their side. Chelsea's hair was pinned in a perfect chignon, her dress a muted shade of navy that screamed respectable. My mother's pearls caught the overhead lights. My father's gaze never rose above the floor. All rise, the bailiff said, and Judge Ellen Porter took her seat. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, the kind who didn't need to raise her voice to control the room. Counsel, you may proceed, she said. Richard stood first, his tone syrupy. Your Honor, my client, Miss Chelsea Carter, is here today to reclaim her rightful role as mother to Sophia Carter. Miss Carter has been sober for 3 years, holds a stable job, and maintains a supportive family network ready to provide for the child's needs. We contend that Ms. Madison Carter has deliberately alienated Sophia from her biological family. Objection, Ethan cut in, already on his feet. Counsel is making unfounded accusations without evidence. Sustained, Judge Porter said. Stick to the facts, Mr. Hale. Richard's jaw tightened, but he moved on. He produced a stack of photographs. Chelsea at school events, playdates, birthday parties. Only they weren't Sophie's, they were other children's, with Chelsea smiling as if she'd been a model parent all along. When it was our turn, Ethan didn't rush. He laid our foundation brick by brick. Your Honor, this is the note my client found with Sophie in Chelsea Carter's handwriting. He passed it up. I can't do this. She's yours now. Gasps rippled through the small gallery. Ethan went on. We have voicemails from the first month where Ms. Carter asked my client to take her for a while and promised to send money, which never came. We have medical records showing Maddie has been Sophie's sole medical guardian since birth, school records listing her as the only legal contact, and testimony from witnesses who saw Chelsea leave Sophie unattended in the rain. He called Patty Green to the stand first. Patty's voice was steady as she described walking her dog that night, seeing Chelsea's car idling at the curb and watching her set the carrier down without so much as knocking. Richard tried to shake her. Ms. Green, could you have been mistaken about who you saw? It was dark. Patty shot him a look. I've lived next door to Maddie for 5 years. I know who I saw, and I know the difference between leaving a package and leaving a baby. Next came Dolores Mitchell, the former housekeeper. She unfolded the custody plan documents in front of the judge. These were in Mr. Carter's study months before Chelsea came here. They were talking about the trust fund. They called Maddie a pretend mom and said Sophie needed to be raised as a proper Carter. Chelsea's face flushed crimson. My mother's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Finally, Ethan called Brandon Miles. He looked straight at Chelsea as he spoke. They offered to pay for our wedding if she went along with getting custody. They wanted that trust fund, not Sophie, and Chelsea knew it. For the first time, Chelsea's composure cracked. That's not true, she burst out, half rising from her chair. Judge Porter's gavel struck once. Ms. Carter, sit down. When it was over, Ethan closed with a line that stuck to the walls of that courtroom. Your Honor, being a parent isn't about DNA. It's about showing up, through storms, through sickness, through the everyday grind. Maddie has shown up for Sophie every single day of her life. The other side showed up when there was money on the table. Judge Porter didn't rule immediately. She said she'd issue her decision after reviewing all evidence. But when we left the courthouse, I caught the look in her eyes. She'd seen enough to know where Sophie belonged. Out in the hallway, Carla put a hand on my shoulder. You did good in there. I glanced at the bench where Sophie sat swinging her feet, her drawing of us folded carefully in her hands. For the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, the truth had gotten louder than their lies. A week after the hearing, Ethan called just after breakfast. His tone was calm but carried an undercurrent I recognized. Something decisive. Judge Porter issued her ruling, he said. You might want to sit down. I was already seated at the kitchen table, Sophie across from me sketching a soccer field with a rainbow arcing over it. My coffee had barely cooled, but my pulse shot straight through me. Tell me, I said. She dismissed their petition with prejudice, Ethan replied. That means they can't refile for custody. Ever. And she's issued a temporary restraining order, no contact with you or Sophie outside approved legal channels. It's renewable for a year at a time. For a moment, the words didn't sink in. Then they did, all at once. The pressure I'd been carrying in my chest for months eased, like someone had finally loosened a vice. She also referred the trust fund matter to the state attorney's office for investigation, Ethan added. Your parents and Chelsea are going to have a lot more to worry about than you. Across the table, Sophie was watching me, pencil hovering above her drawing. Is it good news? I swallowed the knot in my throat. Yeah, baby. It's really good news. Her smile was instant, wide, the kind that made the corners of her eyes crinkle. So, they can't take me? I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. No, they can't. The rest of Ethan's call was a blur of next steps and follow-up paperwork, but my mind kept drifting back to that moment in court when Judge Porter's gaze had landed on me like she'd already made up her mind. Later that afternoon, I went to Ethan's office to sign the official documents. He slid the papers across the desk. This is your copy of the order. Keep it somewhere safe. I glanced at the crisp legal language, the signatures, the seal at the bottom. It was more than ink and paper. It was the proof that the truth had stood up under the weight of every lie they'd tried to tell. "You fought hard for this," Ethan said. "Don't downplay it." "I didn't fight alone," I replied. "Logan, Patty, Dolores, even Brandon, and you." Ethan gave a small smile. "Yeah, but you're the one who never flinched." That night, back at the cabin, the air felt different, lighter somehow. Sophie and I celebrated with store-bought cookie dough because neither of us had the patience to bake from scratch. We stood in the kitchen eating warm cookies straight from the sheet pan, laughing when the chocolate chips burned our tongues. Halfway through her third cookie, Sophie looked at me and said, "Mom, can we do something to mark today? Like, I don't know, a tradition?" "What kind of tradition?" I asked. She thought for a moment, crumbs on her chin. "Every year on this day we eat cookies for dinner. No veggies, no rules." I grinned. "Deal." Later, when she was in bed, I stepped out onto the porch. The night was quiet except for the rustle of wind in the pines. Somewhere in Charleston, my parents were probably scrambling to contain the fallout, and Chelsea was realizing the door she'd tried to kick open was now locked for good. I didn't feel triumph so much as relief. A deep, bone-level peace. Not because I'd beaten them, but because Sophie could finally live without the shadow of being taken hanging over her head. When I came back inside, I peeked into her room. She was already asleep, one arm wrapped around the worn, stuffed fox she'd had since she was 3. I thought about that first night in the storm, how tiny and fragile she'd been in that carrier, and how much we'd both grown since then. The fight was over. For now. But the promise I'd made, to show up for her every single day, wasn't going anywhere. And tomorrow, we'd wake up to a life that was entirely ours. The day after Judge Porter's ruling, the air in Maple Falls felt different. It wasn't that the sun shone brighter or the wind blew softer. It was that, for the first time in months, I could take a deep breath without feeling like the next one would be ripped from me. Sophie and I had slept in, the kind of sleep where you wake up disoriented, unsure if the thing you were fighting for is still yours. When I walked into the kitchen, she was already there, hair a mess, feet swinging from the stool, pouring cereal like it was any other Saturday. She glanced up at me, spoon in midair. "Morning, Mom." It was such an ordinary moment, but the word Mom hit differently now, sealed, protected, untouchable. "Morning, kiddo," I said, ruffling her hair before pouring my coffee. "What's the plan for today?" She grinned. "Well, it is officially cookie for dinner day." I laughed, remembering the deal we'd made the night we got the call. Right, a very important holiday. We spent the morning in the small, everyday rhythms we'd both missed. No phone calls from Ethan to prepare for court, no late-night digging through files. Sophie painted at the dining table while I caught up on a logo revision for a client. Every so often, she'd ask my opinion on which shade of blue looked more like the ocean, but also like the sky. And I'd stop, lean over her shoulder, and pretend to deliberate as if the fate of the art world depended on it. By afternoon, Carla dropped by with Mia in tow. They'd been our unofficial support crew through all of this. Rides, meals, and a lot of late-night pep talks. "We heard the news," Carla said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like cinnamon and laundry detergent. "So, is it really over?" "It's over," I said, feeling the words settle in my chest. Mia squealed and grabbed Sophie's hands, whispering something that made them both dissolve into giggles before disappearing down the hall. Carla stayed behind in the kitchen. "You know, she's stronger than most adults I know," she said softly, nodding toward the hall.
"But you're the reason for that."
I didn't have an answer for that, so I busied myself with setting out mugs and making tea. When they left, Sophie came back into the kitchen, cheeks flushed from whatever game they'd been playing. She leaned against the counter. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Always." She hesitated, eyes flicking to the fridge where her best mom ever drawing still hung. "Do you think Chelsea will try to talk to me again?" The question was so direct, it took me a second to answer. She might, but the restraining order means she can't come near us without going through a lawyer, and if she tries, Ethan will handle it. She nodded slowly. "Okay, I don't want her to mess up what we have. I stepped closer, placing my hands on her shoulders. No one can take this away from us. Not now, not ever. Her shoulders relaxed, and for a moment she just stood there, letting me hold her like she had when she was little. That evening, we baked the cookies together, Sophie insisting on extra chocolate chips, me pretending to be scandalized at her reckless measurements. The house filled with the smell of sugar and melted chocolate, and by the time we sat on the couch with our dinner plates, I realized we hadn't talked about the Carters once all day. Halfway through her third cookie, she nudged me. You know, we should make another tradition too. Like, every year on this day, we do something we've never tried before. What, like skydiving? I teased. She rolled her eyes. Something fun but not life-threatening. Like pottery class. Or painting the living room neon green. I chuckled. We'll start with pottery. When she went to bed that night, I stood in the doorway for a while, watching her sleep. The fight had been ugly, exhausting, but looking at her now, peaceful, safe, I knew I'd do it all again without hesitation. The Carters had wanted to rewrite her life. Instead, we'd written our own ending, and tomorrow we'd start a brand new chapter, one where the only battles we fought were over paint colors and cookie recipes. 2 evenings after Cookie for Dinner Day, Sophie slid a folder across the kitchen table like she was handing me state secrets. The cabin was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the tick of the wall clock we kept forgetting to change for daylight saving. I printed these at school, she said. Don't freak out. Inside were forms from the county website, a name change petition for a minor, and an adoption packet with yellow highlighter bleeding through the margins. She'd circled places for signatures, sticky-noted lines she didn't understand. I don't want to be a Carter anymore, she said, voice steady. Not their kind of Carter. The name caught in my throat. For years, it had been a splinter under the skin, mine too. I'd kept it when I left Charleston because it felt easier than starting over on paper. But easier hadn't meant right. I took her hand. You know you don't have to do this to belong here. I know. She met my eyes. I want to choose us, all the way. I exhaled, something old loosening in my chest. Then we do it together. The next morning, I called Ethan. He didn't sound surprised. I figured this was coming, he said. Good news. With the court's findings on abandonment and the restraining order, the state's ready to move on termination of parental rights. Hale already filed a no contest on Chelsea's behalf. He can read the writing on the wall. Once that order's entered, we'll have a short adoption hearing. We can roll the name change into the same docket. I hesitated. If she drops Carter, I should too. You can file yours in parallel, he said. You sure? I looked at Sophie's drawing on the fridge, us under a heart, best mom ever, and nodded even though he couldn't see me. Yeah, I'm done carrying their name. What are we picking? Ethan asked, lighter now. My grandmother's maiden name, I said. Reed. It doesn't belong to Charleston, it belongs to us. Madison Reed and Sophie Reed, he tried out, like testing a melody. I like it. The weeks between paperwork and hearing felt different than the ones before the custody fight. No dread, just a steady series of steps. Logan notarized what needed notarizing. Patty and Carla signed character affidavits that read more like love letters than legal statements. Dolores mailed copies of the study documents to the state attorney, just in case. At night, Sophie and I practiced new signatures on scrap paper. She curled her R's like little waves. Mine came out blocky, certain. On the morning of the hearing, Maple Falls Courthouse looked smaller than I remembered, the way things do after a storm passes. Judge Ellen Porter had kept the case. Ethan said that was common when matters were related. We sat on the same side of the gallery we always had. No pearls, no chignons, no black sedan out front. Just us. All rise, the bailiff called. Judge Porter's gaze found mine, warmer than during the custody hearing, but no less sharp. Ms. Carter? Soon to be Ms. Reed, she said, and one corner of her mouth almost smiled. Counsel, are we ready? Ethan stood. Yes, Your Honor. The state's termination order is entered. We're proceeding on a straightforward petition for adoption, with an integrated name change for the minor. We also have a concurrent adult name change petition for Ms. Carter, Ms. Reed. Judge Porter nodded and looked at Sophie. Sophie, would you come up here? Sophie glanced at me, then walked to the witness chair with the serious, deliberate steps she used before a penalty kick. The clerk swore her in. Her voice didn't waver. The judge softened her tone. Tell me something only your mom would know. Sophie smiled, small but sure. When I was 6, I decided I hated loud hand dryers, so she kept paper towels in her purse for a year. And she makes pancakes shaped like stars when I can't sleep. And if I put too much purple in a painting, she pretends to argue but lets me win. A laugh rippled through the few people in the room. Clerks, a couple waiting for a traffic case. Judge Porter's eyes flicked to me, amused, then back to Sophie. Do you want this adoption? Is anyone pressuring you? I want it, Sophie said. No one's making me. I picked it. And the name change? She straightened. Sophie Reed, because I'm choosing my family. The judge held the silence for a beat, like a conductor savoring a perfect note. That will do. Ethan guided me to the stand next. The questions were simple. Why adoption? Why now? Could I provide for her? Would I continue to support her education, medical care, the 1,000 small things that make up a childhood? I answered with specifics, report cards, doctor visits, the bench we painted in 6 colors, because Sophie said a happy bench needed all of them. When it was done, Judge Porter stacked the papers, tapped them twice and signed. The clerk stamped each page, thunk, 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 like a heartbeat getting stronger. This court finds the adoption in the best interest of the child, the judge said. Effective today, your daughter is legally Sophie Reed. A corrected birth certificate will issue. And Ms. Carter, Madison, your adult name change is granted as well. She leaned forward. Congratulations, both of you. I didn't realize I was crying until Ethan pressed a folded handkerchief into my palm. Sophie launched herself into my arms, whispering into my hair, Hi, Mom. Hi, my girl, I whispered back. Hi, Sophie Reed. Outside, the sky was the exact kind of blue she loved, ocean and sky at once. We stood on the courthouse steps while Ethan snapped a photo with my phone. 2 Reeds squinting into the sun, a paper envelope of certified copies tucked under my arm like treasure. Last thing, Ethan said, handing me the envelope. Remember, names are for doors and mailboxes. What you've built? That's forever. Sophie laced her fingers through mine as we walked to the car. So, she said, mischief back in her voice, do we repaint the bench? 6 new colors for the Reeds? We'll start with 1, I said, squeezing her hand. But you get to pick it. Purple, she grinned. Of course. We drove home with the windows cracked, the wind tugging at our sleeves, the town rolling by like it had been quietly rooting for us this whole time. The sign on our mailbox still said Carter. It wouldn't for long. That evening, I practiced my new signature on the adoption decree while Sophie taped our courthouse photo to the fridge, right beside Best Mom Ever. The paper curled at the corners, already settling into our lives. Names change, families don't, they're chosen, kept, fought for. Tomorrow, we'd paint the bench. Tonight, we were the Reeds. Spring settled over Maple Falls in colors so soft they almost felt invented. Apple blossoms spilling like confetti over the sidewalks, the creek behind the cabin thawing into quicksilver. It had been 3 weeks since the courthouse hearing, and the mailbox out front now read Reed in clean black letters Ethan had insisted on stenciling himself. Sophie said it looked official, but what she really meant was ours. The bench we'd promised to repaint waited under the maple in our front yard. Its old rainbow had faded, a ghost of the years we'd survived. Sophie stood with a paintbrush dripping in fresh lavender, grinning like she'd just been handed the first slice of cake at a birthday party. You ready? She asked. I dipped my own brush into a deep navy, the color of midnight skies in August. Ready. We painted without hurry. Neighbors wandered past on their evening walks, offering waves and compliments. Carla brought lemonade. Dolores leaned on the fence, telling Sophie how purple was the color of royalty and resilience. For the first time in a long time, there was no undercurrent of watching for the next blow, no tension bracing my shoulders, just the rhythm of brushstrokes, Sophie's quiet humming, and the feeling of being exactly where we belonged. As the sun tipped low, Sophie sat on the porch steps, sipping her lemonade. "You know," she said, "I thought changing my name would feel like losing something, but it feels like finding it." I sat beside her, my knees aching pleasantly from crouching. Names can carry a lot, history, expectations, even weight that's not ours. But they can also be a choice. You chose this. She nodded, eyes fixed on the lavender boards. And I chose you. That landed in my chest in a way no gavel strike or court order ever could. Ethan pulled into the driveway just then, holding a brown paper bag from the bakery in town. "Thought the Reeds could use a proper bench warming," he said, lifting out 2 chocolate croissants and a small cake topped with blueberries. We ate right there on the steps, watching the paint dry under the porch light. It wasn't a grand celebration, no champagne, no speeches, but it felt like the purest version of home. Shared food, shared air, shared future. Later, after Sophie went inside to shower, Ethan lingered. "You've built something solid here, Madison. Not just for her." He tilted his head toward the door. "But for yourself." I thought about that while I cleaned the brushes at the sink. The truth was, the fight had changed me as much as it had changed Sophie. I wasn't just the woman who'd left Charleston anymore. I wasn't the woman who'd measured her worth by someone else's permission to stay. I was a Reed now, by choice, by heart, by the ink on court papers tucked in the drawer beside my bed. That night, I stood at Sophie's doorway, watching her sleep. She'd sprawled diagonally across the bed, one arm dangling, her hair a messy halo. She looked safe in a way she hadn't in years. Safe because no one could take this from her. In the quiet, I realized something. Family isn't the people who share your blood. It's the people who stay, who choose you every day, even when it's hard. And maybe that's the point. Names fade, money runs out, circumstances change. But the love you build, brick by brick, choice by choice, that's the kind of thing even time can't strip away. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, I hope you remember this. You are allowed to walk away from what breaks you, and you are allowed to build something better in its place. It won't be easy. It will be worth it. I'm Madison Reed. This is Sophie's and my story. If it spoke to you, if it made you think about your own definitions of family, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me your thoughts in the comments. Because stories like ours matter most when they remind someone else they're not alone. Tomorrow, the bench will be dry. We'll sit there together, sipping lemonade under the maple, and know we made it, really made it, to the other side. And we'll keep choosing each other, every day.